sorry to cut off conversations. We've got another conversation to share, which hopefully will be fun and extend whatever it is you're all talking about, which I'm sure is fabulous too. So my name is Randall Amster. I'm part of the Earth Commons and faculty from Environmental Studies and Environment and Sustainability. And it's my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker today for the last Eco Talk, I think, of the semester. You know, sometimes when you do these things, you need notes. And sometimes, as a very wise friend of mine says, your notes are actually right here. In this case, that's not the former, but the latter. You know, for me, Tom Fleischner is one of those people. I think we all have people like that. And I would submit, I think we can all be those people for each other, right? That's what it takes to make our lives work. We are all the products of hundreds, maybe thousands of interactions and people who see something in us and they support us along the way. But in my case in particular, it was meeting Tom in our former institution 20-something years ago, where I think it's fair to say we were working in parallel lanes, even though we were speaking about similar things. The methodology of paying attention, of caring about the world, of thinking systemically, putting ecological sensibilities into how we viewed things in life and reality. But interestingly, because I was more on the social, political, cultural side, and Tom was more on the ecological, biological side, we were parallel. We didn't, even in a small place, our silos didn't converge. But when we began talking and encountering each other as human beings and colleagues, I felt like you saw something in me that realized that environmentalism wasn't just a series of lifestyle choices, that you saw a potential in me as a scholar and an educator that I could bring that piece straightforwardly into my life. And Tom and I, back in this era, 20-something years ago, wound up piloting a series of courses called Integrating Social and Ecological Perspectives, which in retrospect may seem not that groundbreaking, but back then it kind of was, even in our university, our college at the time, which was supposed to be about social justice and the environment. The "and" was a wall, not a bridge. And working together really opened something up in my journey. So I just want to say thank you for that. When it comes to Tom as a scholar and speaker, I would say, if I was to sum you up, I would say that you have the mind of a scientist and the soul of a poet. It might be the other way around, but that remains to be seen. But, you know, I think the lessons that Tom will bring to us today are really profound about how we can interact with the world in a non-superficial way that also spills over into how we meet one another in times of challenge and crisis. So with that, it's my pleasure to welcome my colleague and friend, Tom Fleischner.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Randall, for that very kind and wise introduction. It's great to be here at Georgetown. Thank you so much for having me. I live in northern Arizona, so it's a different world here, and of course, a very interesting week to be visiting. I just, before I started getting into my talk, I wanted to just say how exciting I find the work that you're doing here to be. It's really great, and I've known some of it from conversations with Randall, but it's really great to meet folks here. And the whole Earth Commons endeavor seems to me to be on a wonderful track. And I just applaud the work that you're doing here. And I think it's just really exciting that this particular university is really fully in the game of trying to solve these kind of problems in very, very creative ways. So here's to you all for keeping on that good work. Okay, so, whoops, this is not advancing. Priscilla. He's not advancing. Sorry.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, good talk, everyone.
Thanks for having me. Okay. Gracias. Round of applause for Priscilla. Problem solver extraordinaire. Okay, so moving right along, I wanted to start sharing a couple of assumptions that I bring to not only this talk, but to all of my work in the world. And one of those is that the earth and living on this earth is a gift and not a problem. I think way too often in especially academic environmental studies and also on the policy realm, we look at living in this world as being a set of problems to solve. And of course, we do have problems to solve, big ones, but I think we lose sight of the gift aspect at great risk, actually. And tied into that, and one of the themes I'll be exploring here is that loving the world is just as important as grieving for the losses in the world. And I think it's, as I'll get into here, that loving the world is what brings a lot of power and indeed sustainability to our work on behalf of the world. So our what I've referred to as our deepest affinity in the world is to, as E.O. Wilson described in coining the term biophilia, the innate urge to affiliate with other forms of life. And I think we have this inborn connection to the rest of the world that we, again, as we grow older and as culture trains us out of acknowledging those kind of connections, we start to lose that or think that that is unimportant. And again, I think that's a tragic error in ourselves, for us individually and as a culture. So loving the world matters is one of my simple theses here today. And so that leads to the question of what is it that fosters love of the world? If you'll just kind of go with me for a bit here on that assumption that loving the world matters. So what does foster love of the world? Well, again, we have this innate connection with the rest of the world. And I would just submit that in all of our lives, there's endless opportunities for loving the world. I'm just going to fly through some of the examples from my own journeys, but anywhere, any life, any place in the world has its own examples of some of the kind of wonders that surround us, including in large urban areas. Watching flowers come up between sidewalk cracks can be miraculous. Trees re-leafing in the spring, et cetera, et cetera. So these are just a few of the examples, and in the interest of time, I won't talk about each one of these, but again, suffice it to say, we live in a kind of miraculously diverse and fascinating world. And so I have actually, one of the different definitions that I have proposed for the practice of natural history is the practice of falling in love with the world, because I've wanted to emphasize the importance of this aspect of love, which of course in academia has been in general a verboten topic, at least in the sciences, to acknowledge love as a something that even exists in some cases. So, or as the ecologist Chris Normant has once coined a phrase, which I think applies to the practice of natural history, of sympathetic observation. So let's delve a little bit more carefully into what do we mean by natural history. So the term natural history itself was coined in Latin, Historia Naturalis, by Pliny the Elder, just shortly after the time of Christ. And the Historia Naturalis was actually, besides coining this new term, was actually the first ever attempt at an encyclopedia, the first ever attempt where somebody tried to put down in writing everything that humans knew about the world. It's so Historia Naturalis translates as natural history. And that has been confusing for people because natural history in English sort of connotes just looking at the past history. But in Latin and all Latin-based languages like Spanish, historia has two meanings. It means history, but it also means story. And so I think that that's the true meaning of natural history etymologically, is that we're talking about the story of nature. And but of course, in any given place, at any given moment, there is not just a story going on in nature. There's an infinite number of them. So part of the task of a natural historian, of a naturalist, is to keep your eye out, excuse me, and look for stories in nature and decide which ones matter to you, which ones motivate you, which ones fascinate you, and then share those. Or as I have recently described it, as part of our job as the natural history is the practice of revealing and reveling in the story, or you might say the stories, plural, of nature. There's a bunch of some other definitions that have come that have been proposed over the years of natural history in more formal ways. But the common denominator here, I won't take the time to go through each one of these one by one, but notice that close observation is one of the common themes in all of these, and that it is so in other words, natural history is the most empirical of practices. It is based on observation of the real world. So this is the right answer to what is natural history, my own definition, that I came up with a number of years ago, which is a bit more expansive, you might say, than some others. It's as a practice of intentional, focused attentiveness and receptivity to the more than human world, guided by honesty and accuracy. And that last phrase, by the way, I included there because I think so often people who are trying to use nature as a way of justifying their behavior in the world do that through a lot of projection on what they think the world is like without actually necessarily paying enough attention to what is really going on. So if you boil that definition down, it really comes down to it's the practice of paying attention, very simply. And I want to highlight that by saying that natural history in this way, you might say, is a verb, not just a noun. And when we, over the years, I've asked many audiences, like, when you hear the term natural history, what comes to mind? And usually, or most often, it's things like, well, the skeleton of a dinosaur in the Natural History Museum, or drawers of specimens of birds, or whatever. And all of that is, in fact, part of the practice of natural history, but it's more the result of the practice of paying attention, the verb. And so it is both a verb and a noun. And in fact, we are all wired to practice natural history. And I mean this literally, not wires, but we are designed by evolution to pay attention. And there's been some really interesting things written about this, but if you think about the evolution of our species as a bipedal mammal living initially in the African savanna with our eyes in the front of our head so that we have depth perception and so on and so forth, and that we listen carefully, that we are really, really designed to pay attention. And I submit to you that this is an innate aspect of human beings, and you can go to any place in the world, any culture in the world, people speaking any language, and that this is what we're born to do. And my evidence for that would be if you just look at a toddler in any one of those cultures and look at what they do, and it doesn't matter place, culture, language, but little kids, we pick up stones, we turn them over, we smell things, sometimes we taste things, and so on and so forth. And so we are designed to be almost machines to perceive the world and figure out what's going on in it. And as I said before, it's only as we age and mature that culture sort of trains that out of us as being important. And academic science has been part of the reason that has happened, unfortunately. And again, all sorts of people all over do this and get a lot out of it. So back to this idea of love. John Tarrant, who is a Buddhist psychologist, wrote this, that attention is the most basic form of love. What we choose to pay attention to, in fact, is an act of love. And that's also Marge Piercy, the poet and novelist, said something very similar. So I think this is an idea that spans across many kinds of disciplines and approaches to living in the world. Okay, quick look at the history of natural history. So I already mentioned Pliny the Elder really sort of coined the term, but you can go further back in time. So for example, Aristotle didn't use the term natural history, but if you look at the breadth of what he did and all the attention he paid, especially to animal lives, that was all through this practice of attentiveness and observation and description, excuse me, that is involved in natural history. But you can go further back still, and basically every in-place culture in the history of the world has practiced natural history, and we have had to. Our very survival has depended on the successful attentiveness to the world that allows us to distinguish predator from prey, food from poison, et cetera, et cetera. And part of my point here today is that it still matters for our survival, just in slightly different ways. So in that regard, looking back at that human history, I think you can make a case that natural history, again, in this way I've defined it a bit expansively, as the practice of attentiveness, is the oldest continuous human endeavor. In fact, there have never been people in the world without the practice of natural history. It's actually not possible to survive. And yet, there has never been a historical moment in the history of our species when so few people, or perhaps better said, as small of a proportion of humanity has practiced natural history as today. And I think that is a critical concern. And I think it is not coincidental that dearth of natural history coincides pretty exactly with the greater presence in the world of all sorts of social, ecological, and emotional dysfunctions, violence, alienation, depression, anxiety, all of these things, I think, tied directly into this right here. So that's sort of getting ahead. So why does natural history matter? I've already started alluding to it, and the small children walking down the trail maybe suggests some other things as far as our future. So a number of years ago, I wrote this: we are what we pay attention to. And again, the practice of natural history. So what do we pay attention to? Well, what does our culture pay attention to? We spend much of our time focusing on a handful of people who we call celebrities. I think one of the stranger concepts, and all of their doings and comings and goings. And of course, what we pay attention to now is much too often little screens or big screens. And I'm not separating myself from this. I'm just as guilty as anybody else, or at least I don't know what guilt, but I'm part of this along with everybody else. But this is a big concern. And my friend and colleague Laura Sewell, who's an eco-psychologist, has written about there's actual her background is in vision physiology and psychology, and the actual practice of just looking at a two-dimensional surface all the time instead of a three-dimensional surface, it literally changes the way we're able to perceive it. There's neurological changes that happen, and so we literally see less when we do this, looking at smaller screens and always the same distance away from us. Whereas very, very different than the practice of a naturalist in the forest, looking at scanning, looking different distances and so on. The good news is that neural plasticity is referred to works in both ways. So if you step away from the screens and go back into the forest, let's say, then you can resume and rebuild that ability to perceive. But it's I think an underappreciated hazard, really. So what do we pay attention to, or we are what we pay attention to? There's, of course, many, many choices. And besides screens, there's looking at details in the world. There's just all sorts of wonders that if we bother to pay attention and get ourselves out there, we are rewarded amply. So another way of thinking about why does natural history matter, I tend to summarize it in this somewhat simplistic way of thinking of three main components of why it matters. And the first of those is science. That natural history, which, by the way, is oftentimes to the limited extent that natural history is still practiced in academia, it's always considered a subset perhaps an arcane and outdated subset of biological sciences. In fact, I would make the case that that is a flawed perception. And in fact, natural history is much bigger than sciences alone, as I'll try to make the case here. But so examples of sciences. So, of course, in academia, what is most rewarded, tenure, promotions, et cetera, publications, is by promotion of theory. And theory is wonderful and is a wonderful thing that humans have figured out how to do. But where do we get the theories that stand the test of time? Well, I'm primarily a conservation biologist, so my mind goes to biology, and the most profound ecological theories really come from the minds of accomplished field naturalists who have spent a lot of time paying attention out there in the real world. And probably the foremost and most obvious example is the very unifying theory of evolution through natural selection. Both Alfred Russel Wallace and Charles Darwin were both committed long-term natural historians, and they could not have come up with this idea that revolutionized our interaction with the world without having had those years of practice. Just a couple other examples. The equilibrium theory of island biogeography, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. E.O. Wilson and Robert MacArthur, again, both very committed naturalists. In fact, E.O. Wilson, who was one of the most celebrated ecologists and biologists of the 20th century and beyond, he titled his memoir, not Theoretician, which he created multiple fields actually from his theoretical thinking. He titled his autobiography Naturalist. That's what he considered to be the best descriptor of himself. Another theoretical idea that came directly from natural history practice is the whole idea of keystone species and how ecological communities are organized. These are two folks who helped put those ideas together, Bob Payne and Paul Dayton. And some of those early studies were looking at the effects of sea star communities on the coast of Washington, which you see there. Okay, another of the sort of pillars of why natural history matters is conservation, saving the world, if you will. So you have to have good, accurate natural history information to be able to conserve the world. It's as simple as that. You can't base conservation priorities if you don't know where anything lives, what's out there, what the migration patterns are, when species come and go, when they flower, what the phenologies of plants are, all of that stuff. This is a picture of a ecoregion that I've been involved in recent years with, sort of promoting the importance of the Mogollon Highlands ecoregion in the Southwest. And these are three well-known naturalist philosophers, John Wesley Powell, Aldo Leopold, and Rachel Carson, all of whom deep natural history practitioners. And by the way, as far as conservation practice, in this country, one of the things I think that the U.S. can be very proud of is the visionary law of the Endangered Species Act, which I know we're all familiar with, and that really was the first time in any country in the world where there was a legal process to say that every form of life had a right to exist. And really, when you boil it down, that's what that law says. But the process of the law is that you have to make a proposal to get something on the endangered species list, and you can't do that unless you've been out there studying it, because you actually have to say, this is how many there are, this is where they live, this is how their habitat has shrunk, or what have you. So you literally cannot propose a species for protection under the Endangered Species Act without having done substantial natural history fieldwork. Okay, it also matters because people are motivated more by their feelings than their facts. And it's been a fallacy, I think, and there's a lot of social research, psychological research that has gone on in this regard. But we tend to think, especially those of us who are scientists, that if we keep providing more and more information, that cultural behavior is going to change, and that tragically proves untrue. And the climate crisis is certainly an example of how that has not necessarily worked out the way we had hoped. So dealing with feelings is an important thing. And then this is, Rowling, 2007. clearly supported this idea that love is more powerful than fear. And I wanted to throw out that the very word environment, I think, is part of the problem. And I taught in an environmental studies program for almost 30 years. And I love the concept, but the word always bothered me. And if you look that word up in the etymology of it, basically means like surroundings. It's a very sapped of life kind of term. And so and I think it's one of the reasons that environmental issues don't resonate with voters, with the culture, is because it doesn't feel like it's part of us. And so natural history, I would say, is part of the solution to that problem. It literally reanimates the world. It brings the world back to life by focusing on the real world and what is actually going on. Okay, so natural history, I think, also provides the basis for sort of moral or ethical behavior. I'm sure most of you have read Aldo Leopold, and his famous essay, The Land Ethic, perhaps the most famous single piece of writing on environmental ethics, at least in this country. And this is basically the land ethic boils down to these two sentences: that a thing is right when it pretends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community, wrong when it tends otherwise. I love the clarity of that statement. But in the same essay, he goes on to say this, that we can only be ethical in relation to something we can see, feel, understand, love, there's that word again, or otherwise have faith in. So in other words, and natural history is what provides us with those things that we can see, feel, love, etc. So over the years of teaching natural history, after a while, I started asking my students on the last day of class, some years, just how, if at all, has this field program changed the way you feel about your life or the way you are in the world? And over the years, it was interesting how similar the responses were with every group. And these were some of the kind of things that came out. And I wanted to just highlight a couple of those. So humility, something we're about to have in very short supply around this city, at least, is something that natural history supplies readily. When you're walking on a riverbank and see fresh grizzly tracks, or if you are out 20 miles offshore in the Gulf of California and suddenly you have a new friend who's bigger than your boat. Or if you're my friend Harry, a herpetologist, and you see this python, and unlike me, Harry goes towards it, but I wouldn't do that. But again, these are humbling things in the best of ways. Or it doesn't have to be with big, scary animals. It can be just the presence of, in fact, a lifeless environment like this canyon in the Colorado Plateau, or a whale suddenly surfacing in still waters, or even this ice, that the very deep blue color of this ice on a subantarctic island means that it was compressed underneath a huge column of ice for thousands of years and has just been released. And just seeing that color opens up all sorts of stories. Natural history inspires us. And I'm also including in that in the literal sense of inspire, which literally means to breathe in, like we breathe in the sense of the world. And certainly one that has been really a big thing for me is that natural history engenders joy. And I really began to notice over the years of doing this, both myself and with groups of students and others, that at the end of a day of being out in the field, oftentimes my face would hurt because my jaws were sore from smiling and laughing so much. And that is something that I think is really important and certainly a great gift to us as psychological beings. And it also, along these ways, it fosters, you might say, an expanded sense of self, like more, I am part of something larger than just this body right here. I am part of this world. And not unimportantly, especially right now, I think natural history can foster hope in the world by the beauty of the world, by the fascinating examples, and sometimes in very pragmatic ways, like looking at desert plants can help give ideas about how to design desert living spaces and so on and so forth. One thing I've been very involved with in recent years is this idea that natural history actually heals. The practice of paying attention to the world is healing, and that healing is reciprocal. That our loving the world is completely intertwined with our loving ourselves. And actually, a few years ago, my organization, the Natural History Institute, convened a national confluence, we called it, a conference on this idea of reciprocal healing. And if you're interested in this, Laura Sewell, who I mentioned, and I co-edited a special edition of the journal Ecopsychology about this topic. And I took out a number of slides in the interest of time here, so we'd have some time for discussion, but these are some of the kinds of things that have been documented in the literature of both medical science and psychology in the last decade or so. And some of them are strikingly like you don't have to be like all woo-woo and think like nature is great. You look at this and go, wow, it's like good for your blood pressure. It like reduces chance of cancer. It's like there's all these very tangible things that empirical science has documented over and over again. And there was a group of these folks who published a major paper just a few years ago, and they came up from folks all over the world, actually, and they had these different consensus statements to summarize it, and that immersion in nature is good for psychological well-being, that immersion in nature reduces risk factors for various kinds of mental illness, and third, unfortunately, that the opportunities for immersion in nature are reducing in various parts of the world, sometimes very alarmingly. And of course, that is not, those reductions in opportunity are not evenly distributed in the world. There's a whole social justice aspect to that. Okay, natural history is an integrative whole that, in other words, it is, as I said before, it is not just science, and it's not just a subset of science. It includes the arts, it includes humanities, it includes philosophy. And in fact, the organization, the Natural History Institute I mentioned, the tagline of the institution is integrating art, science, and humanities. The wonderful poet Patty Ann Rogers said, without artistic expression, any fact remains alien, unpossessed, and with no reverberations in the soul. Or I love this, Rachel Carson, in her acceptance speech for the National Book Award for The Sea Around Us, said no one could write truthfully about the sea and leave out the poetry. And she is a empirical scientist as well as everything else. Okay, so we understand the world through stories. And this is from Barry Lopez's wise fable, Crow and Weasel, just this character, Badger Woman, says, sometimes a person needs a story more than food to stay alive. And the critical question is which stories and how do we tell the stories? And I was really pleased to see, I was able to go to a class yesterday and see that the focus on storytelling is really quite prominent here. And so bravo for y'all. So how do we tell stories about the human interaction with nature? Well, sometimes not in the most compelling ways if we want to move people's hearts and minds and reverberate in the soul, as Patty Ann Rogers said. And this is not to diss scientific papers or the use of mathematics or anything like that, because it's all incredibly important to do, but it's not enough if we want to shift social behavior, because most people, that's impenetrable to. And is not going to try to break through. But the way that ecological stories are compelling is usually rooted in some kind of natural history story, the story of nature. So might be about predation. It might be about a sort of heroic raising of young on a remote island against all odds, so on and so forth. And those are the kind of stories that sort of break through to people and sort of move us. Okay, I've had the opportunity to speak a bit about the relationship of natural history and sustainability. Something I've suggested for a long time is that essentially in any conservation issue or challenge, there's these three realms of science, policy, and values. And they're always present in any issue, and they're always interacting, even if we don't necessarily see all of them at any given time. And so natural history plays a role here because it informs the science. In fact, it is the empirical basis of the science on which we make decisions about sustainability. And it inspires the values that might make us want to achieve sustainability. And so hopefully with those levers that can influence policy in ways that lead towards the goals that we're hoping for in terms of sustainability. And the United Nations, as some of you are familiar with, has, through a long, multinational, arduous process, has clarified these 17 goals of sustainable development. And I would suggest that the practice of natural history sort of supports all of these, some much more indirectly, but by sort of creating the sensibility of wanting sustainability and connecting and loving the world. And in particular, these five, when you read sort of the fine print about what these are all about, are very much dependent on good natural history. I think it's so natural history is very much tied in with this whole idea of sustainability. So in sort of semi-conclusion, that the practice of natural history, I think, then fosters people who are caring, knowledgeable, and healthy, and who are concerned with sustainability and capable of contributing to it. And so to close, I thought I would tell a short little story. This is a book that I edited a few years ago, and which was trying to put together some of these ideas. It's an anthology, so a lot of different authors, but I thought I would just share with you part of my introductory chapter to the book. And so it's the final night of a week-long group backpack into red earth. After a late supper and lingering conversation, two of us lay back, stunned into horizontality by the night sky. In this canyon of smooth stone, deep in the heart of one of the largest roadless areas in North America, our eyes gaze intently where they rarely focus, upward. The dome of stars is phenomenally textured, with vast depth visible within the Milky Way. Swirls and eddies of pulsating light contrast with the velvet black of infinity. Arcing downward, the gaudiest shooting star I've ever seen blazes brilliantly for a full 20 seconds as it angles toward Earth. Its long tail remains gleaming even after I close my eyes. It's a brief interlude of extended psyche as our minds momentarily stretch beyond their usual boundaries, a sense of delighted union with the larger forces of not only this world of green, but the universe that surrounds it, and better for sharing it with a close friend. Lying face up to the heavens, dazzled, humbled, entranced by the endless array of light, provokes a fundamental feeling of kinship with people through times and cultures. We all look up and wonder. And on these sandstone slabs in front of this long inhabited alcove near 1,000-year-old petroglyphs and discarded clay pots, we see the same framing of the universe as our ancestors, unchanged through human time, but for the occasional steady scoot of a tiny satellite's light. In these singular moments, we are the outbreath of galaxies. Thank you.
We have some time for conversation with our guests, so let's open up the floor. Please, time.
Thank you. This is wonderful.
Thank you.
I like the poet more than the scientist.
Same guy.
I understand.
I have two questions.
Yeah.
The first one, did you read Laudato Si from Pope Francis? Because what you are defending is exactly echoing, I
Yes,
would say,
yes,
his major idea.
yes, absolutely. And it was so thrilling actually to see that come out of that place. And so yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah.
My second question is about the love of the earth itself. So I completely see that it's very clear, and I do love the earth. We call her in Africa Mother Earth.
Uh-huh.
But my love is grounded within my own religion, animism.
Mm-hmm.
We do believe in Africa that nature is very animated.
Mm-hmm.
God is within nature, from the stones to all livings, till humans and even spirits.
Mm-hmm.
So our love for the earth is grounded in our religions and beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
So I would like to know what's grounding your love for nature.
What is grounded in mine?
Exactly. What
Yeah.
are the roots of your love for nature itself?
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that, and that's a great question. Did I ever heard the question right? So it comes from many places, but all direct experience and family. My family, when I was young, didn't have very much money, and so the only way we could take vacations was to go camping in national parks. And that was certainly played a big role. I ended up years later working for the National Park Service for a while. But it comes, I think it's a great question, and it's without a simple answer in my case. But I think that the practice, one of the beautiful things about the practice of natural history is that it self-generates the love. The very practice of doing it, and the more you do it, the more you want to do it, and the more it sort of is self-reinforcing, or a positive feedback loop, if you will. So my own cultural and religious background was very different than yours, but I think also involved a sense of respect for the world. But I think everybody comes to it in a different way. But I think again, as I sort of mentioned, I think that it actually transcends and predates those kind of cultural contributions, such as religion, as you mentioned, which is a great example. And I think it's really important, and both of your examples actually sort of echo one another, and that those are the kinds of institutions, or not institutions, but sort of communities of practice, that there's a lot of work to be done, and that there's a lot of potential success there if we can mobilize those kind of communities. And as you say, the Pope's edict, it was a great step in that direction. But thank you for the questions. Yeah.
Thank you. That was great. I really appreciate how you painted the significance of natural history in the historical perspective, because I'm on your team. But most people on the planet are not on that team. But in the United States in particular, one thing that I see as a bright light is people's attraction to things like Merlin.
Mm-hmm.
They turn on their phone and identify things that they're calling, because they hadn't paid attention to it before. But
Right.
because of this electronic app, and machine learning, AI, they can actually now identify things that are just in the soundscape, which they may not even recognize. Most people don't even recognize the soundscape. Or they can use iNaturalist, take a picture of something, post it, and automatically get 25 identifications for a small little spider. Or they can use eBird and enter data, and that data can then be used for all sorts of questions in the sciences, not to mention just distribution and abundance of things. So we're now seeing this sort of really interesting intersection of how electronics and science, it's almost another sort of piece to your Venn diagram, which is engaging people in another way. I'm just curious if you wouldn't mind waxing perhaps poetically a little bit.
I don't know about the poetry, but
a little bit of the twist that we're seeing in how people are coming to natural history. It may not be initially through the love, but it's sort of getting there indirectly.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Pete. And I agree with you completely. I think that there's So I'm not a Luddite per se, although I've been accused of it probably from time to time, but I think, you know, anti all technology. I think technology is part of who we are, it's part of the human psyche to create technologies. And we just have to be careful about keeping them in line. But so I think something, and Merlin is a great example, and all those examples you mentioned, eBird would be another one that gets a lot of people paying closer attention than maybe they did before. So I think those things are really positive, as long as it depends what we do with them. I had a friend who was a colleague who we were actually, interesting enough, we were at a meeting. This was probably 10, 15 years ago, focusing on the rejuvenation of natural history. And this was when some of those things were kind of newer. And he says, Tom, look at this. And he put his phone down, and then there was a flower on the forest floor, and he put up and he said, Sarah, it's that. And he said the name. And then I said, but Josh, you didn't even look at it. And because he literally hadn't looked he just was looking at his phone. And that was, I think it's too easy to do that, you know, that it's it becomes the end, and like the name in that case becomes the end instead of the means. But I think the technology is a very positive thing, and we just have to not be hoisted by our own petard, you might say. And I think all of those can be great ways for helping people to connect and just the way that you say. So yeah, we just have to be cautious about it because we get so entranced, and of course, cell phones and the internet in general is pretty much designed to addict us. And so we just have to be very cautious. But I would never advocate for not using any of those because it's technology and it's bad. I think that's dead wrong. So yeah, good point. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
Well, I'm very much on board with this, and well, let me just, I have a 10-month-old baby. His favorite thing in the world is caressing plants that are.
Yeah.
So I'm very much on board with that. I was just wondering, what's at stake? And it seems to be many things with calling it natural history. Like there's a call for people to be attentive to nature. For scientists to do field work rather than just labs or theory. But do you think that it should be a mandatory discipline in a major of any type of science? Should people not specialize in biology, chemistry, and the various sub-branches? Should they be natural historians? And a lot of these aspects, I think, especially the emotional attachment, love of nature, could take different forms and names. And natural history was sort of a discipline in the 19th century. There's also moral philosophy that branched off to several different social sciences that and so waving the flag of natural history, what does that bring us? And it might bring some opposition that you might not have from just saying, hey, appreciate nature.
Right. No, it's a perceptive question, and one that I and many others have grappled with for quite some time, because there is some baggage that can go with it. And that sometimes is because of in some cases, sort of colonial mindset that fueled the creation of many major natural history museums and things like that. And so you're absolutely right that in certain cases there's some pushback. And we've spent a lot of time actually trying to brainstorm, would it make more sense to give it a new name? But I always have ended up on the side of, I would much rather reclaim this name, which has been around and which actually, when you really look at it, means something different than what we think. And that's in part because we never came up with a better alternative. But so I think I think it's a good question, and to your question about should it be part of everybody's training, I'd say absolutely yes. It has been for every, whether by that name or anything else and outside of schools and whatever, but it literally has been part of the training of every human being for the history of our species. And even in academia, I think I was telling the students yesterday that before World War II, it actually was part of the required training of school teachers in America. There was a famous book called Nature Study, which was basically how to do natural history. And that was part of the curricula that most education programs required of teacher training. And I think that's what we need, is that sort of thing. And this book is still in press, by the way, Cornell University Press. And the so, but after World War II, other things came along that sort of enchanted us and took our attention away, especially, space exploration and molecular biology exploration, all very cool. But it took attention away, and that's what kind of led to this marginalization. And that has, by the way, been a serious process of marginalization in academia more and more over the last few couple decades or so, and especially accelerated in many universities that have had really proud traditions of natural history, whether or not they called it that. Sometimes it's more under the rubric of field biology or whatever. But when certain longtime faculty members would retire, they would tend to replace them with molecular biologists. And I think molecular biology is very cool, but it's not the whole story. And in terms of how we relate to the world. And part of that, to be honest, I think in many big research universities, if you get grant dollars based in part on what stuff you need. So you bring in a lot more money if you want to open up a gas chromatography lab than if you say, I need 10 pairs of binoculars to lead some students on a field trip. And I think that has played into some of that as well. And yeah, anyway, and to your children, congratulations. And that you might be interested, there's a really cool book that came out, it was over 20 years ago, called The Geography of Childhood. And one of the points they make in there is that children tend to look, as I already said, incredibly attentively, but they tend to look much closer and smaller. And that, again, that idea of kids crawling around and picking things up and whatnot. And then as we grow older, we tend to start looking further and further away. So it's kind of cool.
We have time for one more question. Maybe two. Go ahead, and then we'll end with.
Great. So first off, hi, I'm Michelle. I'm with the MSESM program, one of the master students. Thank you so much for being here today. This is really interesting. I definitely can't help but wondering, so like, as you were mentioning, like in our world, and especially when we live in cities, people get further and further away of understanding like the resources that went into a table or like anything, especially with like the single use and like this kind of culture. And how, I guess, do you have any thoughts on kind of, especially in those urban landscapes, like reconnecting those thoughts for people so they can appreciate like all of the things that went into that?
Yeah, so it's a really important point. Well, I think there is actually a whole very robust sort of movement towards urban ecology. There's a organized section along those lines in the Ecological Society of America, for example. But I think the same thing. Well, first of all, I don't think people living in more remote areas necessarily are more tuned in. In some cases they are, but some cases not so much. And I think conversely, I think sometimes people in urban areas, some of the most incredibly well-organized like gardening programs and food production programs are happening in cities. And Randall showed me the gardens that you guys have going here. It's very, very cool. So, and I think, some of the most, Central Park in New York is like a really famous, and Mount Auburn Cemetery in Boston. Those are two magnets for, bird migration. And so there are opportunities in many places, some certainly more than others. And I don't mean to at all suggest that everybody's got the same opportunity, because that's not true. But I think the same things can happen here. And sometimes it's just like paying attention to the birds that show up at their feeder outside your urban apartment window, or just paying attention when what's happening with the leaves or the flowering, like I said, flowers, plants in sidewalk cracks. I think that there are there is stuff going on everywhere. And I think that's, and similarly, it can draw us out of our small selves into our larger ecological self. But I'm not suggesting that's simple or easy, but I think, I don't think that the urban rural divide is a deal breaker. It's not been my experience. I guess, Priscilla?
Says, I am curious how you think we should address the limited accessibility to some populations, for example, underprivileged communities with natural history.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear all that.
It's the unequal access, like how to, right? If I heard
How do
right.
you address, yeah,
How do you address the unequal access to the kinds of?
Yeah.
elements of the
Yeah.
project?
Well, that's kind of partly what I was just addressing here, from Michelle, was it? Yeah. And again, I don't pretend to have simple answers because there aren't any. And that was like the course that Randall mentioned that we used to co-teach in integrating social and ecological perspectives, that those are the kind of things that come up. But I think that there are, I think we just have to push for that kind of access wherever we are. And again, when one is in a city, it's easy to think that if you live in a small town, then of course you do all this stuff. But I live in a small town, and I'm here to say that's not true, you know? So advocating for access, advocating your kids' schools to take field trips, I knew a guy once, I thought this was really great. He was an ornithologist. He taught at a small college in Wisconsin, but he told me that everywhere he had ever lived, he just set up leading nature walks for kids, and not through any institution or anything. He didn't bother with that whole step. He would just like put up a sign in the public library or something, and people would just come and they'd bring their kids and families, and he did that. He had done that in like 5 different towns where he had lived. And I thought that was kind of brilliant because it just got around all sorts of obstacles right there. And I think most of us can do something like that. But I think a lot of it is also, I mean, again, not to try to oversimplify this, but I think the world needs a lot of great aunts and uncles, you might say, that we can all offer to take not only our own children out if we have them, but somebody else's, or to just take our friends out and help. We all have the capacity to help open eyes and open hearts in the process. But there's no question that some people in some places in the world have a greater challenge with this issue, just as they do with every other kind of issue. And those two things are deeply intertwined as to why those challenges are there. But I do think it's not as hopeless as it might seem sometimes.
Like, not hopelessness is a good note to end on, I think, just to be conscious of our time. Obviously, many systemic issues, but we can all be ambassadors for natural history and what that means.
Yeah.
So, Tom, thank you so much.
Thank you.
for coming up.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And by the way, that's how to contact me. And on my website there in the middle, all my publications, of which there's many about some of what we've been talking about, are available on there.
And thank you to Earth Commons, Pete, for, helping to get us into this space. More to come in the spring semester. And Priscilla, thank you so much for organizing and putting it all together.
And Rebecca and Megan.
Yes, absolutely. Rebecca and Megan. Putting up this meeting. Thank you guys. And Priscilla wanted me to remind folks that the postdoc lunch is in Rice 446, right after this. Everyone just enjoy what you can find out there that inspires you, and we'll see you again next time.
Thank you.